Well, I'm sure you're as stuffed as I am after yesterday's Thanksgiving feast, but we have something to talk about today, Jane. And what are we going to talk about?
We're going to talk about espionage and the Revolutionary War.
Ooh.
This was not exactly a catch-as-catch-can sort of thing, although it was much more of a popular sport. You know, there were fewer people then and fewer complicated things.
Right.
But I just wanted to start out with saying, today, of course, we have the FBI and the CIA and the CID in England. I don't know what you call it here, you know, the counterintelligence. But they had exact equivalent for that in the old days. In the Continental Congress, we had something called the Secret Committee for Domestic Intelligence.
Okay.
And this was passed by the Second Continental Congress, and this is, I got an exact equivalent for the FBI, except that they did not have all the vast technical backup and all the loud infighting that has gone on here. No J. Edgar Hoover in the old days. But then we now have a CIA, which is foreign intelligence, and sure enough, they had a committee of secret correspondence.
Oh.
And this was what was to deal with foreign intelligence.
Okay.
And you don't really see too many examples of that when you pour through all this available material.
I would think it would be difficult with the time lapse between finding out something, say, in England and getting the information to
didn't
the
move as
States.
fast. In fact, we're going to mention that in connection with one case. But then the third thing, the CIA, the Counterintelligence, a committee on spies, it was just called, for tracking within the Patriot movement. Patriot and patriots were often a term used for, instead of Americans. The word American was used, but patriots, there was another word for it. But they, now this FBI one had 8 members.
Oh.
And they all came from the Continental Congress. They were appointed. And one of them, you won't be surprised to hear, was Benjamin Franklin.
Oh, yeah.
Robert Morris was there. He's the one that gets a lot of credit for the financial backing for that war, but as we may note later, he didn't do it all. But the second one now, the CIA, this was only 5 members. Or I'm calling it the CIA, of course. This was a committee for foreign intelligence. 5 members, again, of the Continental Congress. And again, not surprisingly, Benjamin Franklin was one of the 5. And they got going right off the bat in November 1775. Oh. So here they are working away. The matter of tradecraft and how you did these things, this was not ignored either. You had a committee on that subject, sort of technical support committee, and they became experts on codes and ciphers. Although experts in light of our current electronic stuff is sort of laughable. But they were the ones at least who knew what to expect if you saw a handwritten letter and you held it over a flame, or you did something for just to you knew what to try. But they used secret agents abroad, trying to figure out what the others were doing, and use it ourselves. And of course, we found out there were a lot of double agents actually here. People who, of course, right here on the ground, it was easy because most people looked the same, unless of course they were in the military. But they looked pretty much the same. I thought we might start out by mentioning a couple of big names that are in the spying game here early on. One was Nathan Hale. Everybody's heard of Nathan Hale. He's standing up there, this strong little young guy. And unfortunately, Nathan Hale was about the least, the least active, the least adventurous, did the least good, and of course, was executed very, very rapidly. But Nathan Hale was a Yale boy, and he had gone into the Army right when the things began, 1775, I think, already at the end. And he was assigned one day. He said, now, go over the lines. The British are over there. go over the lines and bring back a report on how much of what they've got over there. So he went over, and on the way back, I guess he was just careless. People were very careless. Security was terrible in those days. You talked in front of it, especially women and servants. You talked freely in front of them because they just didn't count.
Right.
And
They weren't worth anything.
Yeah, if they had the brains to understand what it was, they wouldn't know what to do with it, you know.
Right.
So don't worry about that.
Right.
But Nathan Hale was very promptly strung up. And I thought we might look at a picture. I think that's picture number 1, actually. This is, of course, not a photograph of the actual happening, but he would have been he would have been probably in a uniform, but he was not wearing his jacket. But you see the red-coated British uniforms there, and you see some Germans, some Hessians that were hired by the British, you know, to work for them. And they're up on a ladder, literally putting the rope over the branch of the tree, and so they did away with him. I guess his publicity value briefly was all right, but he really didn't do a lot. Benjamin Franklin is another name here, and his participation was very interesting because he went off to France as a minister. There was not an ambassador at that time, but he went off there again, and I think the very end of that, well, it was 78 maybe, right early on, he was sent over there. So he did not participate in a lot of this, but he had a secretary whose name was Edward Bancroft, and Edward Bancroft was in the service of the British.
Oh.
And this is just like some modern spy thing you read or see in the movies. Franklin would talk freely, papers would lie around, you know, all these treaties and these things that were going on, and Edward would eagerly pick them up, write them out in reports, put them in a hollow tree. They had some boxwood trees somewhere nearby, put them on the tree, and his British contact picked them up. And they said, for instance, when a treaty was signed between France and the United States, or it wasn't the United States yet, between France and this country, King George knew about it before anybody over on this side of the Atlantic knew about it. It was too far for carrier pigeons. You know, a lot of things, Napoleonic Wars, they had good news in London there because they could stage pigeons, but you couldn't do that over the Atlantic. So that was an interesting, I think, sidelight, because I've often wondered what he did. You know, he wasn't there through a lot of it. And normally, you know, he would have been out there pontificating, writing articles, probably doing a little spying himself. But that was rather an interesting sidelight to that. Another person that we've heard of a lot, didn't really do any spying, but that was Molly Pitcher. Mm-hmm. Remember all the stories that go around about, and you see pictures of her, and she's handling the artillery there. She's swallowing the thing. She participated in at least one of the campaigns. Most of the action took place in the north. New York State had a great deal of action.
Didn't she go there to join her husband in?
That was a story, and I believe he was killed. But or else she went with him to begin with. I'm not quite sure.
She took his place.
She wound up being an artillery woman and doing whatever else came her way. And I just kind of throw her in on the side because she's not an important person in the. But now the Benedict Arnold is, of course, an interesting case. We all hear, oh, Benedict Arnold, you know, too bad. Well, he was a very good officer to begin with, and he did get a raw deal. That seems to be unanimous in anything I've read about him. Everybody else was getting promoted and getting good commands, not Benedict Arnold. They were getting promoted. Well, he became general, but he was not in the top ranks of the generals. And he became disaffected sometime along in the 1778 or 9 period. And he fell in with Major Andre. There's another famous name, Major John Andre. He was head of the British intelligence. He was an officer, wore the uniform. There was a very good Hollywood movie about that some years back. But he sort of, I guess he helped work on Benedict Arnold and say, well, we'll do much better by you and all that. He, of course, would. And they became friends. And Benedict Arnold was really defected in place. And I don't know, I don't think he'd done a lot of harm as yet, because this was, pretty early. But he was he was blown when Benedict Arnold was arrested. And Benedict Arnold was caught, and he was hanged, of course, which was the ultimate in humiliation.
Right.
Instead of shooting the officer, to hang him. That was not considered so good. But Benedict Arnold kept on until 1780. That was in 1780 that happened, and he then got away. And some of the trade craft I'm going to mention too that they were using. Now we've talked about, you wrote something out, an ordinary letter, leaving enough room in between so that something could be put in. And John Jay, of the Federalist fame, Federalist
Right.
Papers fame, had a brother James who was a scientist in England, and he had developed some good secret ink that was not too hard to make. And I guess you could just use lemon juice. As children, we tried lemon.
Right, we did.
But they had pretty good way of doing that, except that it was, of course, suspected anytime you saw a letter floating around.
It was spaced that way.
With or without, they would figure, well, this just can't be an ordinary letter, so we'll look at it. They also had a very fascinating process, which is referred to under the Black Chamber. And I saw a reference to it's being done already in the 1500s by the French. And this was, of course, in those days, you rolled things up usually, and you put a seal on them. And what they did mainly in this war, I don't know where or how they got tissue paper, how they made tissue paper in those days, but they had the equivalent of tissue paper. And they would, or toilet paper, like that.
Right.
They would write their report on it, usually in code. Then they would wad it into something. And the something was often the quill part of a quill pen, if it was a large one. Buttons, hollow buttons, all those buttons they had on uniforms and clothing as well. But they would write the message and put it away there. And another thing they stuffed it into was a small silver ball the size of a cranberry. And I cannot imagine where they got those and why there were so many of them. They couldn't have been put on clothing, they weren't big enough to sew onto clothing. So that's a mystery to me.
Unless they were beads.
No, they weren't beads,
They
though.
weren't beads.
Because they were hollow inside, you see, and you wadded imagine a piece of tissue paper, you could wad it in there.
Right.
I guess you just had to be careful not to tear it up so that it erased the message.
Right.
But there were some famous cases where this happened. There was one where the British forces, General Burgoyne you had in the east, and General Clinton was in the west, and they wanted to come together and squash the American forces in between. And of course, the British had driven the French out of Canada in 1763, so they were up there. But General Clinton, this is General Henry Clinton, had written a message, an important message, and this message had to be taken by a courier over to the forces of the other side where was aiming. I forgot. I think he was probably aiming for the other general. So a certain individual named Daniel Taylor became the courier for this mission, and he had it wadded into a tiny silver ball and carried it with him. You wonder how it wouldn't get lost in a pocket.
Yeah.
But he set out, and he's walking along, he crosses the lines, and he comes to a bunch of people, and he can't tell which side they're on exactly. And then somebody mentions General Clinton, and he thinks, they're British, not realizing there was an American general, George Clinton, and it was George who was up ahead with some forces. So he wandered bravely on and then discovered where he was. Well, like a fool, they really had very little security, so like a fool. First thing he did was grab for the silver ball and swallow it. Somebody saw him swallow it. And he hadn't been suspicious before, so they immediately fed him full of stuff and made him throw it up. And he swallowed it again, and they said, "No, look, if you swallow it, we're just going to hang you and scoop it out of your stomach. Which would you prefer?" They were not nice times.
No, they weren't.
So he said, "All right, I'll throw it up again." And sure enough, he was hanged from a nearby apple tree. So people were still naive in many ways about these things and how to handle them. Well, see, there was the other particular mention I wanted to. No, I think that's gives you the idea of what resources they had for them to advance. Now, the Black Chamber, I got a little bit sidetracked about that. What they did was everything had a seal on it. They would remove the seal, like an important letter, from general to general. They would carefully remove the seal, and they would duplicate it. Then they would open the thing, read the message, roll it up again, or however they were putting it in a folder, and seal it up, a real seal, not just a repasted seal, and send it off. And thereby nobody would know what was happening. And you had a couple agents up in, one of them was even in Vermont, I think, who came down, allegedly British, on the British side, with secret messages, and they detoured by Washington, who was then somewhere in what was called the Hudson Highlands. So he's down there between British forces, to the farther west and to the east.
Right.
And lo and behold, they stop off. They throw it into their black chamber, take an imprint. Washington reads the message. Somebody makes a copy of it, probably, and off they go. So the conditions were a bit rough and ready. You had widows noticing things. Well, the British took New York at the early, I think at the end of '77 already, and not too long after they took Philadelphia. And the big cheese, the big in command was General Howe, General William Howe. And Howe had quite a setup there. His headquarters moved around somewhat. He was incidentally famous. Everybody's probably heard that famous rhyme about General Howe, who was doing nothing really when they were fighting at Trenton.
I don't think I've heard it.
Well, he wasn't in on the action there where his troops were fighting hard in the Battle of Trenton. And they said, Sir William, he, snug as a flea, not dreaming of any harm, lay through all this snug and warm in bed with Mrs. Loring. So he was carrying on with
and his mistresses
with a local widow. Yes. Well, the General Howe, at any rate, took over the full command, and things began to be a little better organized. He moved into a house in Philadelphia, across the road from the house of a little lady, then in probably 50s or 60s, who had immigrated from Ireland as a young girl. She and her husband, and he was some kind of laborer. She was a midwife. It was a good trade that she could practice everywhere. And she began to pick up, they were Quakers, but she was picking up tidbits of information and getting them to George Washington's forces there. And one of their children was a son who joined the military as well. They later were both sort of drummed out of the Quakers. But she, at any rate, had this nice house, and she was, I guess, probably like a boarding house to his family. And a Major Andre, this famous Andre, was ordered by General Howe to go and take this house over in order to make his headquarters big, have a big conference room. And she happened to have made friends with an Irishman in Howe's, one of his officers. And they persuaded him to let the family stay, let this little lady, whose name was Lydia Darragh.
She'd be no harm.
Yeah, just a dear, sweet little old lady,
Yeah.
And a nice big parlor. Well, of course, naturally, she eavesdropped. The soldier would say, "All right, now, you go to bed, we're having a meeting. Good night." And the family would retire. But one story above it, that she didn't listen through a door or anything, but she was above it. However it was, she heard secret plans for them to go to attack George Washington. And the thing I said White Marsh. I think they might have meant White Plains, because this was in New York. But at any rate, she got it, and she knew she had to pass this on in a hurry. So the next morning, she comes down with her basket, and she says to the British, would you let me go through the lines? I need to go up. There's a mill down there. I need to have some stuff ground. I need flour. And they say, okay, and away she goes. And she would have gone down there, of course, was a contact point, and she could have passed the information. But she happened to encounter a courier. She knew to be an American courier. And he just picked it up, post haste. George Washington had it in no time. So she was doing great work. Another woman out on the end of Long Island, they had a kind of spy center out there, Secaucus, Secaucus, I guess is the name, on the tip of Long Island. She was one of the points of contact. Anything that came over the water there, of course, would be handy to have her there. And she used to send signals by the way she hung her laundry on the line. Imagine that happening nowadays or anything. It'd probably do a lot of good in some cases.
It would.
But nobody would even think.
Hard to find a clothesline anymore.
Some of these basic things. Well, I have some notes here, and I marked some places where particularly important things happened as a result of espionage going on. Oh, these are some pictures. We might look at picture number, it's a later, well, we'll look later and I'll tell you who they are. That's going to be easier. Now, George Washington, along about 1778, had actually furthered forming a ring, founding a spy ring. And the person he put in charge of that was an officer named Talmadge. And Talmadge had a great network. They had couriers, and they had, points, safe points all over the place. And this lady was known only as Agent 355, and she was never identified at all. But she was out there on the end of Long Island, and she did all this wonderful stuff. She got information from Major Andre, and as long as he was in the vicinity, she was sending back great reports, and he left New York. So these people were working hard. They sent information, for instance, when Clinton was moving on down to, South Carolina, they got that word in advance. And Washington's forces were able, and by this time, the Frenchman, the Marquis had joined the forces.
Right.
And he was, I think, operating down there too. So this stuff was really paying off. Primitive as it was, in our terms, no means of a radio or, even I think they did use carrier pigeons here and there, but they weren't common because you didn't have a safe place to leave them and train them.
Right.
And the pigeons had to have a home. Now this was Lydia. We talked about Lydia already. Another thing that these people were very, very good for was capturing secret loyalists, secret royalists. The royals apparently didn't do it backwards so much because after all, they had the military force, and some of them acted as spies, and they had some very effective spies who pretended to be colonists. But the things they could do were really great. They could, of course, find out who was really on the other side. Right. And they could associate freely. They could associate with the British soldiers. Anybody who was halfway nice to them, was taken up because they were nasty. It was not a friendly occupation at all,
right,
in any sense of the term. But spies provided the information when the British were going to be moving eastward toward Rhode Island, through Massachusetts there, allowing the Americans to evacuate because I guess they had nowhere near enough forces to do anything.
Right.
So a lot of these things would have been just wiped out if it hadn't been for this one horse intelligence. I think I had another good one here. There are so many of these that it's hard to keep them all straight. Yes. The arrival of the French army in Rhode Island, this had been an earlier point there, there was another surprise attack, and one of these spies in this northern ring here, through the Culper spy ring, issued a warning. And Washington, was the commander-in-chief, and of course, you wonder at it, even when most of the action was up there in the north, still that's a lot of territory, and how he was keeping tabs on it, trying to keep tabs on it. The story always is that Washington was not a brilliant man in any sense of the term, but he certainly wasn't lacking. I only read about one campaign where he planned it badly. The rest of them were good. And then with this growing spy thing, he did a good one when he found this spy ring, that he really got warnings about all these things.
They'd almost have to have had a lot of couriers, because someone constantly moving on, I think would have brought suspicion.
Yeah.
You know, you live down there, what are you doing up here?
They were often merchants. And one of them was a tavern keeper out from that very tip of Long Island. He ran a tavern out there, so he could easily come back into the city. And he had a contact there, Woodhull. Woodhull was a farmer, and Woodhull really existed out on Long Island, but he could come all the time, allegedly, especially in the season when he had any products. He could come for all that.
Right.
There was no difficulty there,
Right.
moving around. Well, there was somebody else that just flitted through my mind there who was a good excuse. Well, the Culpeper people were part of the reason why they caught Major Andre, because somebody turned up with some sort of, they had seen or heard or whatever, that he was in touch with Benedict Arnold and other, alleged Americans. And so it was through them they paid off. They didn't all do great things. There was a British spy known only as Miss Jenny. And Miss Jenny spread a lot of misinformation, disinformation. We hear all about that from the White House nowadays.
Yes,
and
yes.
It was done there too, I think not on that huge scale, because you couldn't just tweet, or get something in the newspaper the next day or email. It was a while before it would come out in the press. And if people made handbills, the makers of handbills were also good people. A lot of those were really on the American side. But some of them, I mentioned at the beginning, there were a lot of double agents, people that could get away with doing both and had the nerve, to do both. And they were advised. Now, in the case of the American ones, they could be sort of advised by some of the spy ring people. No, don't give this piece away, but tell this. We know they already know this, so so they had regular operations going, although they had so little to work with. One of the best places. Now, how are we on time?
We're down almost to the last minute.
Oh no, because I haven't even mentioned Yorktown. These cases are all so interesting, you wanted to tell about them all. But Yorktown was essentially the end of the war, in 1781. That actually ended in 1783. But Cornwallis was down there, and he thought he had the superiority in numbers, no problem. He set up a pretty good position. But he wasn't reckoning with some misinformation, and he wasn't reckoning with the French Navy. Admiral de Grasse came up from the Caribbean and set up shop out there. But there was someone named Morgan. What was Morgan's? Edward, I think, Morgan. Morgan was a soldier down there, and he was persuaded to give himself up as a deserter, go over there and say, I'm deserting. We read in hieroglyphics about exactly the same thing, how the Egyptians were diddled once by that.
Yes.
But he enters he gets in with, and is arranges to be taken to General Cornwallis, and he says, this is, lots of stuff down here, but nothing for you to worry about. So they take their guard down somewhat. And another one of those wonderful episodes was proving what a good general Benedict Arnold was, because at one stage there, he persuaded somebody to to stay, but by hanging their coat and hat up on the branch of an apple tree or whatever, and with a rope and full of holes, so that anybody passing by later would think, he got it. Only he didn't got it. And he had been raised with the Mohawk Indians, and the Mohawks were siding with the British at that point. And the general said, no, we will go through this charade, Benedict Arnold, if you will do some misinformation for us. Tell the British, when we turn you over then secretly to the British, when they ask you how many troops we have, and he said, we want you to point to the stars in the sky. We want you to tell them we have a huge number of forces. And it worked. They did not get defeated. In fact, they won the next action.
Okay. We're
But-
well into the last minute.
Well, as you know, what happened then to Cornwallis, he was sorely diddled, and Washington came down. And believe me, Washington knew and was grateful for all this help that he was getting there. But Cornwallis was a poor loser. He would not himself take the surrender.
Right.
And I don't think he ever did. I don't think he was persuaded to come around. But yeah, they played, I've named just a few of the bigger actions in which these things took part. But without all the stuff we have today, and without some of this backbiting that goes on, because everybody, of course, had to preserve their own hide.
Sure.
But many of them knew the risk they were taking, of course, like Nathan Hale.
Sure.
He knew the risk. He probably, nothing's going to happen to me, here I am. And I didn't understand. They must have taken him out of uniform to cross the lines. But the next time you see something about the spying with that and how he had only one life to give for his country, well, that's all right, but he was just the first of a long line of really patriotic souls.
Well, it's something that, spying has gone on as long as man has existed, I'm sure, in various forms. And the misinformation probably has also. So it's hard to know exactly what to trust and what not to trust.
Yeah.
So here again, I guess it's the thing they keep spreading around now. If you see something, say something.
Or look at it twice.
Look at it
before
twice.
you necessarily swallow it whole.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's,
Okay, thank you, Jane. I think you've piqued some interest in some of this. Maybe we can look up some on Google and find out a little more about it.
You can. There's a lot of material.
A lot of material there. Okay.
Yeah.